so much for joining us for our midday devotional. Today is September 11th, and you all remember well. I'm sending a message to someone, and but you remember well September 11th. September 11th, 2001. Uh, it was a day that will live in infamy uh, throughout the memories of everyone in the United States. Uh, I remember vividly September 11th. There are three or four layers of September 11th that I want us to talk about today. Uh, Number one, I was 46 years old, or 40, yeah, 46 years old uh, when this thing unfolded. Uh, it was a catastrophe beyond anything that I could ever remember in my life. I don't know what your memories of September 11th might be, but whatever they are, I will assure you, you will never forget it. Uh, it was on a Tuesday morning, around 8:45 to 9 o'clock, somewhere around that time. But here's what I remember. Earlier that morning, I had taken a young man from Oakland, California, who had been in town, leading singing for us for a revival. Ornelius Crenshaw was preaching. Greg Brinkley was the young man's name from Oakland, California. Greg was in town leading singing for us for that Sunday and that Monday. But he had already shared with me before flying out, Brother McClure, I've got to return to Oakland on Tuesday because of prior commitments. So early that Tuesday morning, I got up, picked him up at the hotel, drove him to Baltimore Washington International Airport, made sure that he got on his flight for Oakland, California, came back home, went back to bed, slept until about 8:30 or so, 8:15, got up to get dressed, and there was a news flash, and it was showing a plane flying into one of the twin towers. And as I'm watching, because my wife's a school nurse and she was already gone to work, but as I watched the rerun of that, and they were showing the smoke, and then they would show a live shot of the building burning. And as we're watching the live shot, I see another plane bank around, and it flies directly into the second tower on live TV. I'm certain that if you were anywhere around the country, and if you were awake at that time of the morning on September 11th, 2001, you remember vividly exactly what I'm saying. It's one of those memories that you just cannot get out of your mind. Uh, I got dressed, went up to the hotel to actually drop off some shirts to Brother Crenshaw. And I went into the hotel. He met me in the lobby. And as I was coming out of the hotel, I happened to look over toward Washington, D.C., and I saw smoke billowing from somewhere in the distance in the Washington area. When I got into my vehicle and turned the radio on, that's when I heard the news within maybe 5 minutes of parking at the hotel and getting back into the vehicle, that a plane had crashed into the Pentagon. And my heart just dropped because we knew people working in the Pentagon. This was all on September 11th. And then as I'm driving across town from Oxon Hill Road, St. Barnabas Road area, as I'm driving across town to the church office, which was then located over on McCormick Drive, I hear that there was another plane that was in the air and was en route to Washington, D.C., and they thought it was headed for the White House. The first report I remember hearing was the plane had been intercepted and shot down. That was the first report. But then I heard another report later that said the passengers on the plane had commandeered the plane, or not commandeered the plane. They were trying to commandeer the hijackers of the plane, and the plane went down. Whichever the occasion, that plane that was headed toward Washington, D.C. crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, all on September 11th, on a Tuesday. And that Tuesday night, we were having a revival. As a clinical therapist, I understood that we could not go on with just the revival as normal. So what we decided to do is to use that revival time on Tuesday night as an opportunity for people who chose to come out to talk about the day and to talk about very openly how the events of that Tuesday, September 11th, had directly impacted their feelings, their thinking. And it was really interesting to open up the floor and just let people talk and to hear how people were at work, how people were at home, students were at school, and everybody heard the same news at the same time. And it impacted everybody, even more so us as residents of the Washington, D.C. area, because of the Pentagon. Now imagine the impact this had on people in the New York area. We knew families. We have friends in New York. You've probably got friends in New York, had family, had friends in New York at the time. What impact did it have on them as residents of the area? And what impact did it have on you, knowing that you had family and friends who could have potentially been down in the Manhattan area when that happened? Family, friends who travel, who could have potentially been on those airplanes. See, this thing impacted everyone. I got calls from family in California, in Texas, in Illinois, because they knew that I was traveling a lot at that time, going to churches, doing marriage seminars, doing conferences. And they were concerned, and somehow they had heard that I was on one of those planes, or potentially was on one of those planes. And they called us, and they were really, really anxious, even to the point that my wife told me, look, you've got to talk to them. They've got to hear your voice. So I actually had to call family and let them know from my voice, from my mouth to their ears, that I was okay. What impact did 9/11 have on you? Greg Brinkley, who we had put on the airplane, we had no idea his status, because if you remember, They were concerned that there were other sleeper cells, there were other planes in the air that were scheduled to be hijacked. So what the FAA did was grounded every airplane that was in the air. Greg contacted us eventually, and his plane that had left BWI earlier that morning had been grounded in Denver, Colorado. Greg recapped what that was like. He said it was utter chaos because it wasn't like one or two planes were grounded. And whatever airspace those airplanes were over, once they were ordered grounded, that's where they came down. So there were airplanes beyond count at Denver, Colorado. It overwhelmed the ground crews. So Greg had to get his luggage, had to find his luggage, and then he was on his own. They didn't provide ground transportation, shuttle service, hotel accommodations. He said it took him almost 3 days. This was on a Tuesday, right? He got home to Oakland, California that Friday. That's how serious 9/11 was. What do you remember about 9/11 in 2001? Did it impact people that you knew directly or indirectly? What did it do to you emotionally? The trauma that you experienced by living in this area of the country, how did it impact you? Even with your faith walk, what type internal struggles, what type internal questions did you have about, God, what in the world is going on? God, is this just the beginning of an attack on the United States? It was a day that we will never forget. I remember there was a young lady that was in New York from the Washington, D.C. area on an assignment, a work assignment. And the story, she said, she kept hearing these thumps hitting the ground, boom, boom. And she thought initially that, are we being shot at? Are there explosions going on? And then she looked up, and this was before the towers collapsed, but the towers had already been hit by the airplanes. So they're burning, and she looked up, and she saw people jumping and falling from those skyscrapers. And they would hit the ground and literally explode. You never forget that. You never forget that. You cannot make your mind erase such memories. I was told personally by other individuals and the jobs they work in, they were working in transportation and they had the urgency of transporting VIPs to places of safety. Nobody had time to really think, but they had to act, and they had to act quickly because it was a matter of life or death. I remember people being dismissed from work early that day. And if you recall, if you lived in the Washington, D.C. area, there were traffic jams everywhere around 3 o'clock that afternoon. The congestion was horrendous. It was like we had never seen before. No matter what road you would get on to get off of another congested area, it was completely congested. September 11th, 2001 will live in infamy. That Thursday morning, our revival was over that Wednesday night. but every airplane in the country was still grounded. Brother Crenshaw had to get back to Oklahoma City, but there were no airplanes. I took him to the bus station early that Thursday morning. He was fortunate enough to get a bus to Memphis, Tennessee. Those of you who understand, know logistics, understand Memphis, Tennessee is still about 500 miles from Oklahoma City. But his son was going to drive over from Oklahoma City, pick him up, and drive him, drive over from Oklahoma City to Memphis, pick him up, and they were going to drive back to Oklahoma City. Well, when I dropped him at the bus station, I had already got news that there was a family that was over at Washington Hospital Center that had been directly impacted by the plane crashing into the Pentagon. So when I dropped Brother Crenshaw at the bus station, I went over to Washington Hospital. And when I got there, I saw police everywhere. So I went to the burn unit, the critical care area, to meet with the family. And that's when I found out that President Bush was scheduled to be at the hospital. And his plan was to go and meet and to talk to every person who had been victimized at the Pentagon. He had made up his mind if it took all day, he was going to stay and interact with every family. So the family that I went to visit asked me to stay. And I stayed, but the patient had a treatment. And they could not see the president on his initial tour of the hospital. But he made a commitment, he and Mrs. Bush, they were going to see every person victimized at the Pentagon. So when the individual that I went to see came out of their emergency treatment, it had to have been 3 o'clock in the evening, maybe 4. And they had sent the family and myself to another area of the hospital. And when it came time for him to meet with the family, we were the only family left in the hospital that had not interacted with the president. And they had reserved an area, and he and Mrs. Bush came in, and they talked personally with the family. They were able to communicate their heartfelt empathy toward the family. And I'm standing in a corner, and the president comes over and introduces himself. Mrs. Bush introduces herself. And they just talked and talked because they were shaken by this event. When he found out that I was a psychologist and a preacher, he says, "Will you pray for this country? Will you pray for me?" I'll never forget that day, all because of 9/11. And I thought, like I see on TV, people come in and they chit-chat for 2 or 3 minutes, and then they're gone. They were in the room with the family at least a half hour or more, just talking. Just down to earth. Mrs. Bush talking with me, Mr. President Bush talking. They were just very down to earth people. But I also got to see something inside the hospital. I saw the intensity of the work of the hospital staff. So what we did as a congregation is, instead of taking food to the patients, and because everybody was trying to do what they could, what we decided to do as a congregation is, on that burn unit, on that critical care burn unit, we decided to take food to the medical staff. As a church, we did that as a result of 9/11. And this all took place, I think, maybe by that following Tuesday or Monday. But Food Line, I think, or there was a food store in the Largo area. It is closed now. But we partnered with them. They would invite me over every day at noon. Everybody in the store would stand still and we'd do a midday prayer. And we did that for about a week. But the store also partnered with us. We purchased a lot of food items and they donated a lot of food items. And we took all of those items over to Washington Hospital, set it up in the lounge area for the staff so that the staff would know how much they were appreciated. And so that the staff would know, as a church and as a community, we were fully aware of the stress they were under. But it was a time when our country, for at least a month, was together. That was such a beautiful, beautiful time in my memory about the United States of America, where politics was laid aside by most people, where race was laid aside by most people, and the concern was for our fellow citizens, for mankind. And even today, even as you see this little ribbon, if you recall, almost everywhere you went, almost everywhere everybody you saw was wearing a red, white, and blue ribbon. And that was to show our solidarity for our country and our remembrance of those who had been injured or killed as a result of 9/11. I never wish for another 9/11, but I do wish for the day where, as citizens of this country, as it was shown on 9/11, that we can come together. I do wish for the day where we would once again come together as a nation. I pray that today will be a day of memory for us, a day of reflecting on how we've come through tragedies before, we've come through hardships. And I do believe that with the grace of God, we will come through this current pandemic crises that we're in. And I pray to God that we come through it together and that we will be encouraged through what we can do through the power of God when we all work together. Let me invite you to pray with me, please. Father, as we reflect on the events of 19 years ago, we must remember those whose lives were lost, those whose lives were eternally changed with permanent injuries, whether those were physical injuries or mental traumatic injuries. And I pray today that those families who are still grieving the death of their loved ones, whether they were in the towers, professionally in the planes, or those first responders who knowingly went into harm's way to try and save people. Father, I just pray that you will strengthen their families and that you would give them comfort even 19 years later. Father, I pray for our country that we can reflect on the tragedies that we've experienced as a nation, and yet we can see 19 years later that you brought us through. And I pray that the events that occurred in 2001 will encourage us that if you did it then to bring us through, you are indeed able to do it again. Use us as we encourage others. Through Jesus I pray. Amen. Again, I want to thank you for taking time to be with me today in our devotional. And I also want to encourage you to take time to give thanks to God for how He has continually watched over us and how He will continue to watch over us. God bless you, and I thank you so much for spending part of your day with us.
Oh, don't forget the family prayer. I know Jesus, yes, He will get you there. Lord, when we all get together, hey, don't forget to do no. You know prayer will sail across the ocean. I know it will. Prayer will bring your wandering son back home. Sure enough it will. I know prayer will help you love your enemy. Sure enough it will. I know prayer will teach you right from wrong. Yeah, Lord have mercy this evening. Family prayer. I know my Jesus. I know the Lord will. Yes, He will. He meet you right there. Oh, when we all get together. Oh, don't forget family prayer. Listen. I know prayer will. Oh, yeah. Across the ocean. Sure enough it will. Faster than a plane can go. Oh, yes, it will. I know prayer will. Oh, yeah. Help you in time of trouble. Oh, yes, it will. I know prayer will. Give you strength. Yes, it will. Oh, don't you know? Yeah. Lord have mercy this evening. Family prayer. Will. I know the Lord will meet you right there. Oh, when we all got together. Yeah, forget all our family prayer. Come on, Robert. You know prayer will help you in a time of sorrow. Oh, yes, it will. Lord, prayer. I know prayer will bring peace into your heart. Sure enough, it will. Oh, yes, it will. Lord, prayer. I know prayer. Help you sleep at night. Oh, yes, it will. Just like a